Greetings to you, my brothers and sisters, and welcome to this 24th session on Paul's letter to the Romans. I'm Timothy Muses, lead pastor here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. It's a joy to be with you today as we spend this time together, continuing to wade through the book of Romans, continuing to examine this powerful, foundational letter, not only in Paul's theology and understanding of what he has, but also in just how to live out the Christian faith in the world and what this looks like. So it's a joy to be with you today. It's a joy to be part of whatever your day brings, whatever your day is bringing forth for you. I'm happy to be part of it. I'm blessed to be part of it. That you've taken the time to engage this information, that you've taken the time to engage this work is a blessing to me. It truly is. And it's truly a blessing to be able to present it and bring it to you. For your edification, for your growth, for your advancement in faith. Look, I know that there are so many options out there. I know that there are things out there that are far higher quality production. I get it, and I don't take any. I don't feel bad about that at all. I don't take any offense to it. But that of all that's out there, you've chosen this is truly a blessing, and thank you for that. And of course, like anything that I do. If you find it powerful, please feel free to share it or invite friends to view it. However these words that I present to you, however the work that we do together can affect someone else's life, I want to be part of that. So whatever I can do, please feel free to lay it out there. Happy to have it as part of the sphere. So we're in chapter 9 of Romans. Now I would certainly encourage you, if this is your first time with us, then welcome. Thank you for that. Do make sure, if you get the opportunity, to go back and check out some of the previous sessions that have been presented. As we've been walking through the book from the beginning to now, things kind of build. Paul builds his arguments from the beginning to this point. So we may conclude or may touch on some things today that were built up earlier in the argumentation. You want to make sure that you're able to follow that. If you're joining us again, then welcome back. Great to have you here. Thanks for being part of this time and part of this walk that we are doing together. I would encourage you to have a Bible open in front of you, to be able to read the words. It doesn't matter what translation you use, translation, paraphrase, that's all. Whatever you choose is fine. The Message, the NIV, the New Oxford. I use the New Revised Standard Version, so the reading that I bring is the New Revised Standard Version. But you can use whatever you want. I think that multiple translations are actually a good thing. So feel free to do whatever, to work however on that. So we're in the 9th chapter of Romans. Okay, so Romans is in the New Testament. It's the 6th book of the New Testament. So the Bible's divided up into 2 sections. The Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the story of creation all the way up through pretty much the fall of Israel. The Old Testament ends about 400 years before Jesus is born, and it ends with the Romans and the people of God under oppression. The New Testament is the story of Jesus and the creation of the church and the apocalypse, the future. So we have the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The book of Acts, and then the book of Romans. So we're in the New Testament, the 6th book. Now, I do this, I do this for a couple of reasons. One, I don't ever want to assume that people know, where things are in the Bible. I have learned over the years that even those who spend a great deal of time in church aren't quite as versed with wading through the Bible as they should be. The other thing, though, is that as believers, we need to know how to engage this book. Just in general, but more specifically, where pieces are. So we need to know how to engage this book. So with that being the case, we need to know where these things are. All right, so last week we started off in chapter 9. Now, unfortunately, I think I wrote down the wrong ending verse. So if I overlap, I'm sorry. I think I remember where we kicked off, where we stopped last week. But if I overlap a little bit, forgive me for that. But that's where we are. So last week we were talking about Paul, Paul, in his understanding, that he so desires that the people of Israel come to know Christ that he'd be willing to be cut off from Christ for their sake, for their salvation. The people of Israel had it all, but yet they desired, actually, to be honest, to be perfectly honest, it wasn't the people of Israel as a whole. It was through the leaders who wanted to keep power that led the rest astray. It's not that the people wanted to disobey God. It was that the leaders disobeyed God because they wanted to keep their power. And unfortunately, I don't want to walk down the too political road, but when we engage the scriptures and we engage our faith, it engages the world. But all too often, we see that even still today, where leaders are elected to make choices for people and then they make choices for others, either to maintain their own power or support those who got them into power or think they got them into power. And that's always a dangerous scenario, always a dangerous scenario. So Paul says that he would allow himself to be accursed, cut off from Christ for the sake of my own people, my kindred according to the flesh. Paul sees the power of Christ to be so beautiful and so wonderful, he's willing to sacrifice it that the Israelites would come on board, that the Israelites would adopt Jesus, accept Jesus, proclaim Jesus. But then, he goes on to say, look, that's not, that's not going to happen. It's up to, again, and faith is a choice. Faith is a choice. We get to choose whether we are going to embrace Christ or not. Now, I don't want to say that we get to choose salvation, because that's a gift given to us. I don't want to say that we get to choose how we get salvation, because that's a gift given to us. But there is an accountability part. There's a part, we're not just marionettes where God dances around and bounces us around. We get to choose. We get to have an active role in this. Even though we can't acquire our own salvation, even though we can't acquire our own hope, we get to say that we acknowledge and accept and want this, or we get to say, no, we're going to go off on our own. We get to do that. And sometimes we do it out of pride and stubbornness. Sometimes we do it out of idolatry. We see something else that looks better. Sometimes we do it because someone else teaches us something different. But at the end of the day, my brothers and sisters, you and I, we get to choose. We get to make the choice as to whether we will or will not follow Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. We get to make that choice. And that's where Paul is talking about. Paul's saying, look, I wish that the people of Israel would embrace God. I wish that the children of Abraham and Isaac and Rebekah and Sarah, that they would embrace God too. And sometimes, and here's the thing, and I think this is kind of where Paul goes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it today. Sometimes people don't embrace God because what God is doing doesn't make sense, according to human rationale or personal experience. In the ancient world, the firstborn was the firstborn. Firstborn was the most important. But we see in the bloodline of Jesus, in the bloodline of Abraham, which is the bloodline of Jesus, we always see God choosing the second. So Abraham has two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. God puts the Israelite race through Isaac. Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob is the one who is chosen to elevate the people. Jacob becomes Israel. And from Israel comes the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons. And the chosen mother for Jacob is, Rebekah, Leah's younger sister. Leah's younger sister. So God doesn't always work in what would be not only traditional, but historical and rational and even logical. And as people of faith, if we trust God, if we trust where God is going, if we trust where God is presenting, if we trust what God is doing, then in fact, if it looks outside of our logic, our reason, our construct of the world, then we must ask, what is to be trusted? What is to be trusted? Our experience of the world or God's work in the world? Let's keep in mind, folks, we only see a very little bit. God sees it all. So, if we're going to rely on our own insight, which we do a lot of, then we could very well miss what God is up to in the world. And we see that, for God says to Moses, this is verse 15, and I think this is where we left off last week. For God says to Moses, I have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. God gets to choose, and whatever choice God makes is right, even if it doesn't look like it. Whatever choice God makes is right. I mean, if we look at the crucifixion, all right, it's over here. If we look at the crucifixion, if we look at God giving up his son for the death of the world, does that look right? No. Does that look logical? No. Does that make sense? No. But it has the ramification that it needs to. God knew this, and God embraced it, even if it doesn't look right to us. So God will have mercy on whom he will have mercy. Now, why God has mercy on some and not on others, we don't know. Because we can't see the full picture. We see pinpricks, we see little bits, but we don't see the whole thing. God does. God will have compassion on whom God has compassion. So that's where Paul picks up. So this is verse 16. So it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who shows mercy. For the scriptures say to Pharaoh, I have raised you up for the very purpose of showing my power in you, so that my name will be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he chooses, and he hardens the hearts of those whom he chooses. So why God did what God did, why God does what God does, it would be awesome and incredible if we had an answer to that, and there are many who have asked why, and not gotten the answer. But the role is this. If we trust God, then we trust what God does is right. Now, please hear me. There is evil in the world. There are monsters. Sometimes those monsters are strangers and sometimes they are not. As long as sin rules, runs, operates in the world, then evil will operate. The promise we get at the end time is that evil will be destroyed. We're not in the end time yet, so evil still has a foothold. So I say that God shows mercy that sometimes we don't understand. And sometimes God shows mercy to those whom we don't think deserve it. And I would be the first to say it. So, with that being the case, my friends, Paul would also argue that there are those who don't deserve mercy, that they don't deserve compassion, that they deserve what Pharaoh got, beat up. Maybe they do. And maybe they are. Again, we only get a portion of everything. All right? So, but at the end of the day, why God allows something to happen and not something to happen, why God, we have to trust in the power and the providence of God. And that's a hard question. It's a hard thing. And I'm not, by any means, please do not hear me saying that, if you or someone experienced something awful, that God should have stopped and God didn't. I'm not saying you just need to schlep it off. I'm not saying you just need to let it go. No. I'm not even saying you don't hold God accountable. You can't. But what God sees is far more than we do. Salvation, where Paul is going. And I raise this up because for some that might be the question. When this comes to salvation, I think Paul is really focusing more on salvation than on earthly judgment, temporal punishment. Our salvation doesn't depend on our will or our exertion. We cannot will ourselves, beg ourselves, buy ourselves, defeat ourselves, work ourselves into heaven. We cannot cajole, convince, or dupe God into letting us in. That's not how it works. It is up to God's mercy. If God is merciful and wants us into heaven, we are in heaven. If God decides not to be merciful, for whatever reason, then God won't be. That's God's choice. And whatever God chooses, it is accurate and faithful, because that's what we hold on for God to be. So then, he has mercy on whomever he chooses, and he hardens the hearts of whomever he chooses. Pharaoh, again, Paul raises up Pharaoh. Now, I want you to keep in mind that when we look at the 10 plagues given by God through Moses, Pharaoh is willing to let the people go multiple times. Pharaoh is willing to let the people go. But God keeps hardening his heart. And there's a reason for that. One, because God was actually expecting Pharaoh to have a little more spine. But the other is the proof of God has to be so intense. God wasn't going to lead with the 10th plague, the angel of death, but God wanted to make sure that everybody was clear. That God just wasn't in charge of the bees and the frogs and the boils and the sun and the moon, but God was in charge of life. And so God intentionally hardened the heart of Pharaoh over and over until God got to the 10th plague. And even then, even after the 10th plague, Pharaoh's kicking the Israelites out, and then God hardens his heart. Because God wants Pharaoh to chase after him into the Red Sea. And they do. So God chooses mercy or hard-heartedness. Now, we don't get to convince God. We certainly can live a life that leans more towards God. We can influence mercy or hard-heartedness. We can influence what God does based on how we live. I mean, why should God, in any stretch of the imagination, have mercy on someone who's a scoundrel and a jerk and hurtful? And God may choose to do that. That's up to God. But we don't see that. We don't see that example in God. Any more than why should God choose to show mercy to a scoundrel or wickedness? Scriptures are clear. We can influence how God chooses to respond to us based on how we act, how we live. Whether God shows mercy or hard-heartedness, we can influence based on how we live. But ultimately, it is up to God. Verse 19, you will say to me then, why then does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who indeed are you, a human being, to argue with God? Will what is molded say to the one who molds it, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over clay to make out the same lump, one object for special use and another for ordinary use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with such patience the objects of wrath that are made for destruction? And what if he has done so in order to make known the riches of his glory for the objects of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? Including us, whom he has called not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As indeed he says in Hosea, those who were not my people, I will call my people, and those who was not beloved, I will call beloved. In the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called children of the living God. So, I question. So what this does now, Paul says, okay, so the question would be, why then does he still find fault? If it's up to God, if it's fully up to God, if it's completely up to God, then are we divine marionettes? Do we just dance around at the will of God and God's, making us whatever we are? Well, no, we actually have the ability to resist his will. It's futile, but we have the ability to resist his will. We have the ability to resist the will of God. And the reason we have that, we are what's called created co-creators. We are the top of creation. We have been given this free will. Faith is not forced. Faith is a choice. Love, relationship is a choice. It's not forced. God's not forcing us into this. So we have the ability to resist God's will. We have the ability to see clearly what God is asking us to do and turn away from it to do what either looks good, feels right, what we want to do. We have that ability. We can turn away from the will of God. I mean, come on, that's what sin is. Sin is turning away from the will of God. You know, when we think about the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Why would we pray that if God's will isn't already reigning in our own lives and in the lives of those around me? I want you to ask yourself something. I know that might be a shocking statement when I say that we can resist God's will. I want you to ask yourself. And if you need to pause this and think about it, then pause this and think about it. I want you to ask yourself, one, do you know God's will for you? Do you know God's will for you? And two, are you following it? One, do you know God's will for you? And two, are you following it? Who, indeed, for who can resist God's will? Well, all of us can resist God's will. Is it futile? Yes. Does it lead to death? Yes. Does it lead to pain and suffering? Yes. But you know what? We are really good as a species to go down the road of pain and suffering even when it's futile, even when we don't want to do it, even when we know we shouldn't do it. Even when we know we shouldn't do it. Who are we indeed to argue, a human being to argue with God? So if we look at God as the molder and we as the clay, then however God has made me, it is not my place to question that. I can't say, why didn't you make me like that? Why didn't you make me a... And again, now, please. Again, I'm saying these things, and I know that there's still a lot of debate about people who don't, who struggle with their identity, who struggle with their place. I get that, I do. But even someone who's clear in their identity still struggles. I think that's part of how we're made. We're made to struggle. We're made to question. We're made to argue. We're made to look. We're made to dialogue. God has a right to make us this way. I don't necessarily know how long creation would have lasted in a utopia. I think utopia would have been fraught with far more struggle. It was. It didn't even take one generation for utopia to fall. We as humans are created in a certain way. We're created to think and act a certain way. God has made us this way. We are not made inherently good. We are made inherently evil. And if we were left to no guidance whatsoever, then we would end up inherently evil. We learn kindness and grace, generosity through education, being taught that by those who are kind and gracious and generous. It's not something that's inherent in us. We don't inherently share. We don't inherently love. If we were left to be feral, then we would be feral. So the potter has the right to take one lump of clay and make it into something ornate, and that same lump make something ordinary. Not everybody has to be the top of the heap. God doesn't make everybody the same. God makes everybody uniquely. And I know that it would be nice for everybody to be rich and powerful. But no matter how rich everybody is, someone will always be richer. Someone will always have to clean the pipes. Someone will always have to fix the light bulbs. Someone will always have to work on heart surgery, someone will always have to sweep the floor. We're all made for our own purposes. God makes us as he sees fit. God, desiring to show his wrath and make known his power, he endured with such patience the objects of wrath that are made for destruction. And what if he does so in order to make known the riches of his glory for the objects of mercy? So here's the thing, God endured the sinfulness of the created order for so long. God endured without bringing forth wrath the sinfulness of humanity. But rather than bringing wrath, God showed mercy. Rather than bringing destruction, which we all could have deserved, God could have swept down and wiped us out. That's what we deserve. But God gives us life. God gives us life by pouring forth the wrath of the divine onto the Son. It was on Jesus that the wrath of God is poured out, so that we as the created order do not have to face the wrath of God, so that we as the created order do not have to face the wrath to come. The wrath of God is poured out on Christ, so Christ pays the punishment so we can receive the mercy. Without Christ taking the punishment, we don't get mercy, we get wrath. Paul argued earlier on in this book, the wages of sin are death. All have fallen short of the glory of God. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. None of us deserve anything but death, but we get mercy, not wrath, because the wrath that God had laid out, endured the patience of, was poured forth on the Son, not on us. The only one who didn't deserve it got it. The only one who didn't deserve it got it. And for that, as was spoken to the prophet Hosea, those who are not my people, I will call my people. And her who is not beloved, I will call beloved. Because of the work that Jesus did, because of the action of the cross, because Jesus took the wrath of God on him, those who were outside of grace, those who were outside of mercy, those who deserved wrath and wrath alone got mercy. Both Jew and Gentile. Because Jew didn't make you outside of the wrath of God. If you were a Jew, you still had the wrath of God ready to pour forth in you. It was the divine mercy of God in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ that did away with the wrath. So anybody, who deserved death, anybody who deserved wrath, got mercy, not because they did something different, but because of the gift of Jesus Christ. Because of the gift of this. Because Christ took the cross, anybody who deserved death, if they believe in him, have faith in him, then they get mercy. That's the price. That's the gift. That's where the wrath goes. That's what God chooses to do. And in the very place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," there they should be called children of the living God. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, through Jesus' willingness to take on the full scope of the wrath of God, through Jesus' willingness to not only leave the throne in heaven, but to live a human life, to know the full totality of human existence, pay the price of execution, even though he didn't deserve it, for our sake. Those of us who believe in him, us who adopt him, those of us who own our faith, who proclaim him. Though you are not my people because you are sinful, you shall be called children of the living God. The rite of baptism, the rite of proclamation, is the rite that says, though you are not my people, because you've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, you become my children, not because you've earned it or worked for it or somehow through your exercise or your work you have bought it. And I'm searching for the word that was there earlier, and exertion. That's what I'm looking for. No. It is through divine grace and mercy. It is through God's love and grace poured forth out of the resurrection. Because Jesus was willing to take the cross. Because Jesus was willing to take the wrath. And he didn't fight it. He didn't argue against it. He took it in. He took the wrath of God into himself for us. And because of that, God, who for so long desired to show his wrath and make his power known, who endured with much patience the objects of wrath, that would be us, humans, the riches, in order to make known the riches of his glory for the objects of mercy, which also are us. Isn't it funny? You know, we're like the bane and the blessing. And we actually sing that in one of our hymns, bane and blessing. The blessing and the curse. We are actually the positive and the negative. We are the crafted in God's image, but yet we are the ones that have rebelled against God's image. We are the one that have such incredible imagination for beauty and love, and also the same incredible imagination for brokenness and awful. We can create with such majesty and destroy with such ferocity. Us humans. So we are both at the same time objects of wrath and objects of mercy. And the difference is Jesus. For without Jesus, we would just be objects of wrath. We would fall very short of the glory of God. And God would pour forth that wrath upon us as we deserve it. God would pour forth that wrath upon us because we do truly deserve it. But because of Jesus, that wrath was poured out on him on the cross. And God, in the glory prepared beforehand, including us, whom he has called not from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. The glory that was prepared beforehand. Now, when we read that, let us not think that the glory of Christ on the cross was something that was laid forth before the foundation of the world. That would assume that humanity would fall. That would assume that God's creation would be imperfect. That's a really dangerous assumption to make. No, beforehand means it was planned. The cross was planned. The glory was planned. Maybe not centuries or decades or millennia in advance, but it was planned. Which means that Jesus didn't wind up on the cross by accident. He didn't get here by some mistake. He got here because this was part of the deal. This is where the wrath of God pours forth. This is the object of wrath so we can be the objects of mercy. That's what Paul is telling us. So why should we follow this Jesus? Why should we follow the commands of God? Because this Jesus did this so that we don't do it. This Jesus took the cross for us so we don't have to take the cross for ourselves. That is the mercy of God. And those who are not my people, I will call my people. Those who are outside of God's grace, those who are sinful and broken, will be called people of God. Every time that we go through the waters of baptism, every time someone professes Jesus, they are now my people. Every time a sinful, broken human being professes Christ as Lord and Savior, now you're my people. That's awesome. That's incredible. I love that. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, that was, you are sinful, you are broken, you are outside of God's grace. In that place there, they should be called children of the living God. In the very house of God, where God was separated and the people were pushed away, it is in that very same house where Jesus came and said, you will be children of the living God. The object of wrath is the Son, so we can be the objects of mercy. Because if we don't have the Son taking the wrath of God, then we would. And I'm here to tell you, brothers and sisters, there's no way that we'd be able to handle that. So thanks be to God. Thanks be to God that we are loved so deeply, so incredibly. All right, my friends, I'm going to leave it here for today. I'm going to leave it here. So if you have any questions, my contact information will come up at the end of the session. And you can reach out to me. I'll do the best I can to answer them for you. I pray that you have a great day, whatever your day brings. I pray that it's great and wonderful and awesome. And we'll see you next time. Be well, and God bless you.